This is a CBC podcast.
This might be a little too heavy. Let's see if we can find a little something lighter.
There might be a lighter blanket.
Tante, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. And you're just in time. Producer Stephanie Cram and I are building a blanket fort out of a whole pile of Hudsons Bay point blankets. A perfect place for conversation about Indigenous community and culture.
Okay, so what do we have to do?
Kids have been doing this for hundreds of years. Okay, so you're going to grab the one side of the Hudsons Bay blanket, the iconic blanket that everybody knows, and you're going to pull it over to that side. Oh no, failed
We need
already.
something to secure it. It's falling. It's falling.
We're fired.
Maybe kids are smarter than us.
Kids are smart. Now, the trick to a good fort is all in the layers. Success. We got a wall.
We got a wall.
Lighter blankets go on the top. Heavier blankets are your walls. A bit of string or your mom's couch. Maybe a couple of chairs. And then we take the big HVC
Yeah, maybe
blanket.
anchor it there. Yeah.
And then there you go. There's the roof. Some heavy books to keep things in the right place. And ta-da! Blanket fort. Why, you ask, am I making a fortress of blankets? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The blanket holds great cultural significance to many Indigenous nations. They were used in trade, given as gifts, and even offered a way to record community history. But the relationship with blankets hasn't always been a cozy one. Over the years, it went from a highly sought-after trade item to a symbol of colonialism. There have even been accusations of blankets being used to spread diseases. Now its tattered reputation has been reclaimed and rewoven into art, ceremony, and remembrance. So let's head into the blanket fort and find out a little more. What? I'm not as young as I used to be, but we're gonna get in here. All right. I'm in. Ow! Okay. You know, these were easier to get in when I was 10. This is the Unreserved Blanket Fort. You're all invited, Canada. Come in, there's plenty of room.
We wanted to take the ceremonial colors that are in our ceremonies, that are in the ceremonies that he would take part in. And we would get these colors from using like ochre and sweetgrass, charcoal to create colors when you're going into ceremonies. So we recreated these colors to the best of our ability, and we were able to put them onto a blanket that we wanted to honor him with.
Blankets hold story. A patch blanket can be pieces of a family story. A star quilt can connect you with your ancestors. And a knitted quilt can hold the precious memory of a grandmother. Well, a new line of blankets from Calgary have history woven right into their modern designs. Mona Royale's great-great-grandfather was a Blackfoot warrior and medicine man known as Boy Chief. They wanted to commemorate his memory and share his story with others. Instead of using pictures and words, Mona's family wove his legacy into bold colors. Mona Royale is the owner of Boy Chief Trading Post on the Siksika Reserve in Alberta, where the blankets are for sale. Welcome, Mona.
Thank you.
So tell me, who was Boy Chief?
Boy Chief was a big part of my life and a big part of legacy with Siksika. He was my great-great-grandfather. It's a big honor for me. It's just a man who really set the foundation for our family.
And when was he alive?
In the late 1800s to the probably 1950 kind of era.
Mm. And what kinds of things did he know? What was he accomplished for?
Well, he was one of the very first businessmen in Siksika. He was the one who did all the dealings with the Indian agents, as they called them back then. Because back in those days, people had to get permission to leave the reserve. So he was one of the ones who was able to say who was going back and forth.
I also understand he was a medicine man?
Yes, he would. The people would go to him for all kinds of ailments because of the way that he was raised as a little boy.
So many accomplishments that he had brought to his community. Tell me about how he brought back the buffalo.
Well, our buffalo in Alberta were going extinct, and him and 2 other guys from the Blood Reserve, Kawena, went down to the States. They knew that we were in desperate need, that the buffalo was declining very fast, and if someone didn't do something in Alberta or Canada, the buffalo probably would have went extinct. So what he did was he went down to the Missouri River, and they started traveling, and they got across the line, and they were in need of buying 3 buffalo, 1 male, 2 female. So they went down, they managed to get a hold of 3 calves, bring them back into Alberta, and they were able to reproduce those buffalo, which today the 3 buffalo that they brought down, that bloodline still exists, all areas up north and right into Banff, right into Browning. So they were the ones who were able to help save the buffalo.
Wow.
So
That sounds like it could be a movie.
I know. It could be. It could be. Yes.
And so instead of a movie or a book, how did your family decide to honor his legacy?
We have a wonderful man, Chief Crowfoot. Lots of stories. Sitting Bull. Lots of stories. I thought there's a lot of other men hundreds of years ago that were never honored, and he was one of them.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take our first blanket, which what we called was the vintage collection, meaning just ceremonial colors went into that blanket. Buffalo grass, green, ochre, black charcoal, the white, not really the pure white, but kind of the white of a cloud. Because every color that you develop, to me anyway, on a blanket has to have some sort of meaning. And the design itself came from some beadwork that was on his regalia. I do have some pictures that my dad had given me, but we went right into the Glenbow Museum archives. And we pulled all the pictures that they had, and we started noticing a certain dimension was always kind of there. So we decided to use that as his diamond that was on all his outfits. And when we developed the blanket, we also had to develop the box, and the box itself has a beautiful picture of a buffalo on it. And we wanted people to know that he had a part of history with the buffalo.
Why did you want to preserve that story in a blanket?
Back in the day, a blanket meant a lot of things. You were able to trade goods with it. You were able to cover your family with it. And in those days, Boy Chief was probably one of the first to know the value of what a blanket was. Because in those days we used hide. We used buffalo hide. That was our blanket. But him being a businessman, he knew what the value of a blanket was. So he was able to teach his people how they can use or trade blankets for pelts or vice versa. So we thought, when you're having ceremonies, when you're proud of someone, you drape a blanket over someone as a gift. So there's a lot of meaning to our blanket. When you're in our societies, you can tell when people are at sundances, you can see who has a blanket draped over them. And out of, love and courtesy and kindness, you respect, okay, that's a member over there. We have to be respectful. So there's lots that a blanket can teach you.
And of course, it's more than a blanket, as you said. You also share his story with people, and in a way, you're in the Blackfoot history. Why do you think it's important to share these stories?
We have to start sharing our stories because we're losing our elders that lived in the era of no electricity, no water, no houses. They lived in teepees. They used the water that runs through a river. They used fire as light. We can't lose those stories because we're never going to be able to live through that era again. We have to preserve as much as we can. But in order to do that, we have to listen.
Well, thank you so much, Mona. That was a beautiful, beautiful story, and I feel so warm now.
You're so welcome.
Mona Royale is the owner of Boy Chief Trading Post on the Siksika Reserve in Alberta. Her family created the Boy Chief Blanket in honor of her great-great-grandfather, warrior and medicine man, Boy Chief. Check out the pictures on our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. You'll also find some pictures of me right here in my self-made blanket fort. Still ahead, it might just be the most recognizable blanket in Canada.
I think it's emblematic of the trade histories here. It's also emblematic of the smallpox endemic.
How the Hudsons Bay Blanket went from a symbol of status and trade to one of colonization. When you think about iconic Canadian blankets, what comes to mind? Are you thinking of a cream-colored blanket, perhaps, with green, yellow, red, and blue stripes? The Hudsons Bay Company has been making its famous wool point blankets since the 1700s. Besides bedding, they were also a form of currency and worn as robes. They also became a valued item among Indigenous people in Canada. But over time, these iconic blankets took on a darker history. Paul Hackett is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan's Department of Geography and Planning, where his research focuses on medical geography, Aboriginal health, and historical epidemiology. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rosanna.
So at one time, the Hudsons Bay Blanket was used as a kind of currency and even as a status symbol. Can you tell me about that?
Well, it certainly was an important trade good in the fur trade. And as you say, it's iconic across Canada and was well valued by the Indigenous people in the country. It's probably beyond the utilitarian aspect of it. There's also a bit of a political meaning to it in terms of cementing friendships and relationships there as well. But certainly was indicative of that relationship in the fur trade between the Hudsons Bay Company and the Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that it was used as a trade item, what kinds of things was it used to trade for?
Predominantly furs, but one could also trade for food, and the fur traders themselves were dependent on, in many contexts, Indigenous people for their food, for transport, for all manner of services and goods. But predominantly, I think the key thing was to obtain furs to sell back in Europe.
Mm. And when did that change?
Well, we start to see, I think, later in the 19th century, we start to see differences in the trade. But as there's more competition, perhaps the Hudsons Bay Company's blanket loses a bit of its luster. And as time progresses, maybe it isn't as seen as the key trade good in the fur trade. And
then eventually, it seems that it has fell into some sort of disrepute, as it were. Many people have, heard the rumors that these blankets were infected with smallpox and then given to First Nation communities. Did you find any evidence that the Hudsons Bay Company was involved in that?
I've found absolutely no evidence that the Hudsons Bay Company ever purposely infected anybody with blankets and smallpox. And I sort of recognize the sort of power of those stories and the power of that history. And I don't want to sort of say that it never happened. But I think I would argue that that there's no evidence for it. That doesn't mean that that didn't occur, but there's no evidence of it as far as I've been able to find, other than oral histories, I guess, stories. And two, that it would have been very much against the interests of the Hudsons Bay Company to release a lethal disease among the people who are supplying their furs and buying their goods, and potentially expose themselves to the risk of retaliation if indeed that was found out.
Now, you said there was no evidence that you could find that this happened, but that you're talking about written evidence. You also mentioned that there's oral history around this. What kinds of oral history have you found?
Nothing other than more recent things. And I'm thinking that there may be some conflation of the Hudsons Bay Company as representing all sort of European interests in Western North America, perhaps, and other potential businesses and entities who may have engaged in this behavior. And we know, for instance, in the 1700s that the British certainly did purposely transmit smallpox during the 7 Years' War at Fort Pitt, which is now Pittsburgh, during the siege there. So we know that it did happen, and I'm wondering if there isn't some conflation of these things. But most of what I've heard is not in older oral histories, but in more recent things. And again, that's not me saying it hasn't happened or that it isn't valid. It's me sort of wanting to question more about what the context is of these stories.
Right. So it did happen, as you said, at Fort Pitt during the 7 Years' War in the United States. But when or how, I guess, did this rumor come across the border?
That's a great question. And it's people who have a greater ability in sort of interpreting Indigenous stories and or maybe conducting that kind of research might find that out. I know, again, going back to the evidence, that there was a case on the upper Missouri River where an American fur trader certainly claimed that he was going down to St. Louis to pick up some smallpox to eliminate some of the local people. That was his claim, and I never was able to sort of verify that he ever pulled it off. But the idea was out there, certainly. So I think for the Hudsons Bay Company, their position in the fur trade west and northwest was very precarious, such that had they been accused, the consequences would, particularly through most of the fur trade period, they required the local people to feed them, to help them, to transport their goods, to do almost everything for them. There were small numbers of people who were essentially reliant on local people for their well-being and their health and their trade. It just made no sense for them.
I also understand that the Hudsons Bay was also involved in public health in some way. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, they played a major role in providing what we'd call public health services to First Nations and other Indigenous people in Canada for much of the fur trade era. Oftentimes it might be provision of food when necessity reared its head, or in the case of smallpox, it might be early on trying to prevent the spread of smallpox, say at York Factory in northern Manitoba, through a quarantine program, and then later on through mass vaccination programs across Canada in the 1830s. They were, I guess, the de facto public health agency in much of Western Canada up until Confederation. It seems atypical for a fur trading company to be involved in provisioning goods, looking after the elderly when necessary, or in this case, distributing vaccine across much of Western Canada. It just seems out of role for them, but in fact, it makes a lot of sense because if we look at the impact, we have a joint stock company that is basically motivated by profits, that if they want to maintain those profits, you have to make sure that there are stable conditions, that people are healthy, that they are able to trap, to hunt as well, to provide food. So the Hudsons Bay Company had a very vested interest in making sure that things ran as proper as well as they should commonly.
And so if we don't know when this rumor came across, why do you think that it still persists to this day?
I think there's a certain amount of discontent, and people still feel a bit of animosity towards the northern stores and northern operators who charge outrageous prices for food or who don't provide good service. Or I know that people can remember back to a time when the Hudsons Bay Company was not looking after the best interest of Indigenous people in Canada. Certainly they made a lot of money off of the transfer of the Rupert's Land eventually to Canada. And so I think there is a certain amount of animosity towards the company, and some of it is rightfully felt.
Paul, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rosanna.
That was Paul Hackett, Assistant Professor of Medical Geography at the University of Saskatchewan. We're going into the Winnipeg Art Gallery vault. This is exactly how I thought an art museum would look like. All the treasures. I'm with Jamie Isaac, curator of Indigenous and Contemporary Art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She's about to show me a piece by artist Rosalie Feybelle and talk about why the Hudsons Bay Blanket keeps popping up in the work of Indigenous artists. And this is it? This is brilliant. Oh my gosh, you have to tell me what's going on here.
Sure, it's Rosalie Feybelle's I Woke to Find My Spirit Had Returned. This work Rosalie did in 1999 out of her series Plains Warrior Artist, and it's print on paper. It has Rosalie posed as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Instead of Virgin Mary looking over her bed, she has Xena the warrior princess. And it shows her awakening beneath a Hudsons Bay Blanket. On looking is the cast of The Wizard of Oz. And instead of the uncle, it is Mona Royale looking through the window. And I think your reaction upon seeing it coming in today was pretty amazing. You laughed really hard. And
I was a knee slapper. I slapped the knee. I was like, that's amazing.
I think you were doubling over. It's a really beautiful work, and within its how she uses satire to think through our Canadian history.
The HBC blanket is quite iconic, and it tends to show up in a lot of Indigenous art work. Why do you think that so many artists are weaving this into their work?
Well, the blanket means so much to different people in Canada, and it's I think it's emblematic of the trade histories here. It's also emblematic of the smallpox endemic that happened in the early 1800s, late 1700s, and the idea that smallpox was actually spread through biological warfare in the trading of the HBC blankets.
Would it surprise you to learn that earlier we had spoken to a historian who studied particularly the HBC blanket, and he found actually no evidence that, written evidence, let's be clear about that the HPC blanket was used in spreading smallpox to First Nations. That would have been counterproductive, he argues. That wouldn't have made any sense. Perhaps that happened in the States, but not on Canada's side. So does that surprise you to know that that's not actually something that's documented?
I think that our history has been censored in different ways and continues to be, and public documents continue to be censored. The research that I've looked through was late 1700s, and there were letters apparently that were found, and it was with the Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in North America, Geoffrey Amherst, in 1763, that encouraged the use of blankets infected with smallpox as a means of biological warfare. And there are few and upcoming art historians that are finding this out and openly talking about the smallpox endemic that happened and the usage of the blankets to spread European disease through trade. And so others are also saying that the blanket was not necessarily intentional. It wasn't an intentional policy to spread biological warfare, but nonetheless the blankets were coming from European ships here to North America to then trade with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So the question on whether it was intentional or not is questionable and really interesting to unpack in our history.
You might say it's a little piece of history we've yet to uncover.
A blanketed history.
You're good. So when people see work that reimagines this iconic blanket in a way that they maybe hadn't considered before, how do they often react?
I think, just through my own experience of working with the blanket, with Leah Decter's work, Official Denial, it was really interesting because some people actually got really upset when we were using the blanket as a document or archive to talk about historical and contemporary ongoing injustices of colonialism in Canada. Indigenous artists, contemporary artists, are using the blanket as a cultural material that is political and that is cultural and historical to bring that material into contemporary narratives around our histories. Mm-hmm. You know, it's another form of trade by trading this information that we know and that people have researched, and to bring that into a larger Canadian dialogue. I think to kind of dismantle what we know about our histories in order for us to more understand one another is a really interesting way of using the blanket in art.
Thank you, Jamie. I always feel much smarter after I speak with you.
Yeah, you too.
Jamie Isaac is curator of Indigenous and Contemporary Art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, talking about the importance of blankets in Indigenous community on the show today. Still ahead, how a blanket took center stage at a wedding in Little Saskatchewan First Nation this summer.
After our pipe ceremony that joined our families, and after the tying together of our wrists, which joined us as partners, we were wrapped by our parents, so Leonard's dad and my mom, with this blanket. And so it was put around our shoulders with us in the middle, and we were presented to the people who had gathered to witness our ceremony for the first time as husband and wife.
More on that in just a few minutes. Have you ever played a game of parachute where you hold all the corners of a big sheet and you run underneath it? Well, replace the sheet with a blanket, then stand on top of it while it's being lifted in the air. Sound fun? It's called the blanket toss and is practiced by Inupiat in Alaska and the Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories. Reggie Jewell is a champion of the blanket toss, winning the gold medal at the World Eskimo Indian Olympics. He even appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson to talk about it. Reggie is a retired politician in Alaska. Here he is explaining the importance of the blanket toss.
My name is Reggie Jewell. I'm from Kotzebue, Alaska. The blanket toss is a couple of the original purposes, I guess. One was to throw people, because on the edge of the skin, there's ropes woven along the edges for people to grab on, much like you would see on the springs of a trampoline. And people get on those ropes. And the purpose is to get someone in the center, and by pulling together and getting a rhythm, they toss a person, they throw a person as high into the air as they could get them. And that gave them elevation, sometimes 10, 15, 20 feet, so that they could see things a little bit further out in the distance. I think people quit using the blanket toss for looking off in the distance once the binoculars were introduced. The blanket toss was, Nulikatuk we call it, was part of the celebration of a successful whale hunting season. This became part of the World Eskimo Indian Olympics and became a competition, which it gets to be very exciting. I had a very frightening experience where I flew off the skin, which wasn't uncommon, as sometimes when somebody was thrown, if you weren't right in the center, the chances are you might be thrown off to the side, and people would have to move the skin to catch you. Well, sometimes the crowds get so packed around the skin you can't move, and that's what happened to me. I was fortunate. I was caught. I was very shook up. I thanked the gentleman, who happened to be a Catholic priest, somebody I'd never seen before, and I turned away and walked away from him after I said thank you. And unbeknownst to me, When I walked away from him, I walked right back onto the skin. And when I was on it, when I walked on it, the men, the pullers, immediately lifted the skin back up and threw me again. But I think that was that experience, walking back on it, even though accidentally, unintentionally, cured my fear. I just turned 67 just this last summer. I jumped on the skin, and I've gained a little weight, and kind of find a way to energize the guys because I'm a little heavier than I should be, but they threw me up the first time, and I was kind of teasing them, but challenging them at the same time. That there was no way with that kind of height that I could do a backflip, and they really needed to step it up. And they give you a cadence. It's a 1, 2, 3 count. And as they were doing the count, I felt the energy. Sure enough, I got at least enough height to pull off a backflip and land on my feet and keep my balance. If you were to take quite literally the saying, it takes a community to raise a child and apply it to the blanket toss, that's it. It's like so many things in our lives. While we may get to a certain point of progression in how we do in those things, the backstory is there's a lot of people along the way that helped to make all of that happen. And I think that, to me, is the biggest takeaway. And I think that applies to just about anything we do.
That's Reggie Jewell telling us about the blanket toss from Alaska. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, talking all about the cultural significance of blankets on the show today. One person who knows a lot about the Indigenous history of blankets is Elizabeth Kawena Montour, a project archivist at Library and Archives of Canada. She gave us a quick history on the use of blankets, which you can hear exclusively through our podcast feed. Here's a bit of what you'll hear if you subscribe.
So a popular style blanket is known as a star quilt. It's a piecework blanket, usually multicolored or different shades of a color, and they form a 5-pointed design. Recently, AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde stated star quilts are designs of First Nations. The Cree Assiniboine in Lower East Saskatchewan, the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people say that when you are wrapped in a star quilt blanket, your ancestors are amongst you and with you. In the media, you often see Indigenous leaders and chiefs give politicians star quilt blankets, and this is a goodwill gesture for the relationship in the future.
And that was Elizabeth Kawena Montour from Library and Archives of Canada, talking about the contemporary significance of star blankets. To hear more, subscribe to the Unreserved podcast through your favorite podcast app, because you'll get all our regular shows and special podcast-only episodes we'll be producing this season. As more Indigenous people return to ceremony, along the way they have picked up pieces of their culture and remade it. Cree writer and scholar Tasha Sumner recently got married. Her wedding to Anishinaabe singer Leonard Sumner took place on his reserve of Little Saskatchewan. And an important part of their ceremony included a blanket.
My name is Tasha Sumner now, and I'm Cree and Trinidadian. So my mother had the blanket tucked away. And if you ask my mom, she'll always say, oh, I loved Leonard first. So I truly believe that as soon as she saw this blanket, she was like, that's the blanket that my girl is going to marry Leonard under. And so as soon as we were like, yeah, we decided to get married, my mom was like, I have the blanket. I think that was one of the first words out of her mouth. So the blanket is a trade wool, so it's quite thick. It's beige in color, and it has different geometric designs on it of all different colors. And it kind of actually guided the way, when a bride is thinking about her wedding colors, the blanket was actually instrumental in guiding the colors for the rest of the wedding. That nice kind of toasty brown color with different greens and reds. And I think like a sunset palette is how I would describe it. We got married in my partner's home community of Little Saskatchewan First Nations, which is about 2.5 hours north of Winnipeg. And the actual ceremony took place in his parents' backyard. So it's in this little corner of the reserve by the lake. It's really quite beautiful. So we were married behind my partner's parents' home, actually on a piece of land that was flooded under deep water from the 2011 flood, which evacuated communities in that area. So it was kind of like a place of rebirth that hosted our wedding ceremony. We always talk about how oftentimes our people gather around trauma and loss. And we think it's really important for us to put as much mindfulness as gathering around love and joy and hope and happiness. So after our pipe ceremony that joined our families, and after the tying together of our wrists, which joined us as partners, we were wrapped by our parents, so Leonard's dad and my mom, with this blanket. And so it was put around our shoulders with us in the middle, and we were presented to the people who had gathered to witness our ceremony for the first time as husband and wife. And so it was the wrapping of both of us, but also the joining together in a very symbolic way of our two families. I know for my mom, it was really important that we be wrapped in the blanket to symbolize, our union as two people who will walk through life together and all of the beautiful chaos that is life. It symbolizes the beginning of our home together, our family. So it's always, we talk about our home fires and keeping our home fires strong. And I think that blanket is a cultural symbol to supporting a couple to have that strong, beautiful life together as one. And then it's also a physical reminder. We keep it in our living room. It wasn't put away, never to be seen again. It was, it's there every day. I use it when I'm watching Netflix. I use it to be warm and cuddly. So it reminds us of the day, of our commitment together, of the people who took time out of their lives to be witness to the ceremony and the coming together of our families. So we have a little one on the way, and I was pregnant at the time of our ceremony. So for me, I just, I continue to hope that our home is a place of happiness and joy. And so for me, I hope that blanket just continues to hold healthy family members under it, that we can, wrap our little one in it. For me, that blanket is just about continuing to grow a home.
That's Tasha Spill at Sumner. She and her husband Leonard used the blanket in their wedding ceremony this past summer. And while we're on the subject of blankets, in a couple of weeks we'll be dedicating an entire episode to one of the staunchest child advocates in the country, Dr. Cindy Blackstock. In our intimate conversation, Cindy talks about a baby blanket that guides her work. It's a blanket that belonged to the late Jordan River Anderson. Jordan was born with complex medical needs, and while the province of Manitoba and the federal government argued over who should pay for his home care, he died in a hospital in Winnipeg at the age of 5, having never spent a day in his family home. Jordan's principal is a Child First principal named in memory of Jordan River Anderson, and Jordan's family wanted Cindy to have his blanket.
Jerlene and her dad, Ernest Anderson, came to Ottawa in 2007 to see Jordan's principal pass through the house, and they gifted then Member of Parliament Jean Crowder, who introduced the motion for Jordan's principal, with his baby blanket. And so it's actually in the original footage where that goes through the house. And when Jean retired from politics, she worked with the family, and the family would ask that we have it. So it's in our office. And that baby blanket to me is our accountability back to Jordan. It's a reminder that Jordan's principle was founded by Jordan River Anderson, and that it's not just a policy, it's not just a program, it's a sacred responsibility. And that's why there is no kind of quitting on Jordan. Mm-hmm. It's like, this is a spiritual responsibility we all have. And so I have his baby blanket, and whenever I need a reminder, if I'm feeling crabby or I'm feeling tired or whatever, I just walk by that baby blanket and I think it's time to pull up your socks, Cindy, and get back to work.
That was Cindy Blackstock talking about Jordan River Anderson's baby blanket, which hangs in her office as a reminder of all the work that's left to be done for Indigenous children in this country. Cindy Blackstock will be my guest on September 22nd. Make sure you tune in or subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss it. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community culture and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.